Thank you, Rabbi Steve. Good morning, everybody. Nice to be with you again. I want to speak about a personality who was very involved with both the War of Independence, Yom HaAtzmaut, and Yom Yerushalayim, and we are in the weeks between the two. That is Rab Shlomo Goren. He was born in February 1917 in Zambrów in Poland, and his parents moved to Eretz Yisrael, which was then Mandate Palestine, in 1925, and they settled in Kfar Hasidim. And at the age of 10, the young Shlomo was sent, he enrolled in Eitz Chaim Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. And then 2 years later, he was around 1929, he entered Hebron. Now, you might know that in the August of 1929, there was an Arab uprising throughout what was then Palestine. And Hebron was one of the severely attacked places. Many of the Jewish inhabitants and the Bachura Yeshiva of Hebron were murdered. And it was subsequent to that the Yeshiva, which was a snif of Slabot in Yerushalayim, moved back to Yerushalayim. And the young Shlomo entered the Yeshiva then. In 1934, when he was 17, he took Samicha, age of 17, and he wrote his first sefer on korbanot, on sacrificial offerings. Then, interestingly enough, 2 years later, in 1936, he joined the Haganah, and he became very active in that movement. And as we know, for the next decade or so, the Haganah was fighting the British, particularly with regard to limiting Jewish immigration into what was then Palestine, and also, of course, fighting the Arabs who wanted to destroy the people living there, the Jewish people. This is something that's tragically gone on ever since. In 1940, he enrolled at the Hebrew University, and he studied classics, mathematics, and philosophy. And then in 1945, he married Sivia, who was the daughter of the famous Nazir of Yerushalayim, Rav David Kohen. And then we come now, and yes, I must mention as well that he became a paratrooper. So he was very active. In fact, during that time when people were missing or people were lost in battle, he would, under fire, he would go and rescue them, particularly when they were injured or when he had to bring back the bodies of those who had been killed. So he would, throughout his life, he was very active doing that. In 1948, with the declaration of the War of Independence, he was asked by the chief rabbinate, by Rav Herzog, by Rav Uziel, whether he would then head the military rabbinate, that he would become Rabbi Rashil at Sahal, the very first one. Of course, the Haganah was now the Tzva Haganah Yisrael, the Israel Defense Forces. He was very active with the military rabbinate. He made sure that there was kashrut throughout all the armed forces, which of course has persisted till today. He also wanted to integrate both Sephardim and Ashkenazim into the army. So he wrote a siddur called Achid. I don't think it's used anymore, but at the time was looked upon very favorably. And of course, he answered halachic questions, particularly Pidyon Shibuyim, which we are suffering with today, ransoming those who have been taken in battle, those who have been kidnapped. Between 1948 and 1968, he was the Rabbi Rashil at Sahar. He had other rabbis under him, of course, but they had to formulate halakhic questions and determine what was going to happen with those in the army. And what he has determined still is carried on in the army today. As we know, that when he was the chief rabbi between 1968 and 1978, we know that in 1973, I'm sorry, I've gone on too much. I said between 1948 and 1968, he was Rabbi of Shilat Sahar. 1967, that was a 6-day war, which we know broke out on Monday, the 5th of June that year. And on 3 days later, on the 7th of June, what we now call as Kafet Iyar, the 7th of June, which became Yom Yerushalayim, the parachutists dropped into the old city because they're asking Hussein to keep out of the war, and he decided not to. And because of that, the paratroopers were able to fall into the what was the Ir Atikah and capture it, and capture the wall, and capture the old city. And there are two very iconic photographs of that period. The one is of Moshe Dayan, flanked by Uzi Narkis and Chaim and Yitzhak Rabin, walking down to the Kotel. And the other iconic photograph is of Rav Goren himself holding a small Sefer Torah and blowing the shofar at the Kotel, surrounded by the paratroopers. And that became the iconic photographs of that time. In fact, just before Shavuot of that same year, 1967, Rav Goren took a shofar, ascended Mount Sinai, reputed to be the site of Mount Sinai, and he blew the shofar there on Erev Shavuot to reenact the scene when Matan Torah was given and the sound of the shofar could be heard. In 1968, he became the chief rabbi, Ashkenaz chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. And 4 years later, he became the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. He was 55. Rav Unzerman, who had retired from that office, was 86. So he was a relatively very young chief rabbi of Israel. He then became courted in controversy. The first controversial matter was to do with what are known as the Langer twins. They were a brother and sister. Their mother married twice. She did not have a get from the first marriage. And so the Langer twins were counted as mamzerim. What Rav Goren did was, with a bet din, he actually regularized the second marriage. He was able to deem that the first marriage was not kasher. And so the twins were regularized, and the taint of mamzerut was taken off them. This was very controversial, because even though Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Henkin supported what Rav Goren did, and he wrote a long teshuvah which he sent out throughout the Jewish world, saying how he'd been able to regularize the marriage of the Langers. Nevertheless, the yeshiva world did not countenance it, and he became there was controversy over it. Even though, as I mentioned, those two great personalities, Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Henkin, supported what he did. The next controversial move was when he said that there was a certain part of the Temple Mount of the Har HaBayit where you could go and daven there. And the majority said no, because we are now called Tamei Meitim, and we cannot become purified, tahor, through the ashes of the red heifer, and there's no temple anymore. So they said you're not allowed to go beyond the Western Wall. And you might remember that from 1967, notices were put up at the hotel saying it's asur to go beyond this time. That was another controversy. The other controversial issue was when Sinai was back, and with the Oslo Accords, he was opposed to any move that gave back any part of Eretz Israel. And again, that became controversial. He remained chief rabbi from 1973 to 1983. And then when he retired from office, he became the head of a yeshiva called Idra, which was it was near the Kotel actually. And then, by the way, he had three children. They became, one was a psychiatrist, and they became famous in their own right. When he retired from office, he founded that yeshiva in the old city, and then in 1994, in October of that year, he passed away. He's remembered as a very important figure to do with the chief rabbinate, because, as I say, to this day, he's looked upon as the founder of the chief rabbinate. He was succeeded in office by Rav Piron, who later went to Switzerland. And for that reason, he's remembered very favorably. On the other hand, he was embroiled in certain controversial issues, and for that he's remembered as well. But nevertheless, he was a fiery individual. He was the fourth Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. And he's, as I mentioned, he's remembered for the personality. He was a great personality. And for that reason alone, he's remembered all these years. And he should be a blessing to all of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's I think, a member of this synagogue married Rav Goren's granddaughter. I think Josby, Simon Josby. That's I think he married Rav Goren's granddaughter.
Will you speak up?
Yes, Lord, my
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Silverman. That's very interesting, very timely. So I will say goodbye to those on Zoom. See you all next week. Just do the